Hey, what's rocking everyone? So today we're starting part 3 of the Django Web Framework video series. In this video, the objectives we're going to cover are setting up our requirements.txt file, understanding and setting up URLs and views, and then understanding and setting up our models. Now before we jump into those 3 objectives, I did want to actually install one additional package. It's called Django AutoSlug. I did forget to install it in the previous video, so I'm going to install it now before we go ahead and set up our requirements text file. So first thing we need to do is we need to make sure that we go inside of our virtual environment. So I'm going to say source, my project env, bin, activate. Now we're inside of our project environment. Now I can say pip install Django, and we're going to say AutoSlug. Make sure you type in install correctly. Bam. Alright, now we have Django AutoSlug. Alright, so I'm sure you're wondering what is a requirements.txt file and what's its purpose. So requirements.txt file is a great way for you to manage the dependencies of your project. Otherwise, there's no real way of knowing the dependencies that your project has. So by making sure that you update this requirements.txt file is a great way for you to keep track of the dependencies that you currently have in your project or inside of your environment that you're using. So to create this file, we're going to say pip freeze, and then we're going to throw that into requirements.txt. Okay, it's going to populate a file right here. And now you're going to see we have Django all auth, we have Django AutoSlug, .env, storages, tinymce, we've got gunicorn, and we've got pillow. So those are all the dependencies that we did install. Some of these come here by default, which isn't a big deal, but we do have the main dependencies that we did install. Okay, awesome. All right, so what's next? Well, we're going to be jumping into our URLs and then our views. So to explain first, all projects start off with a main URL file, and what I mean by a main URL file is they all have one inside of the project folder, okay? So you can see here we have a urls.py file, okay? So one thing we should do right away is we should include this functionality of include, okay? And this lets us kind of link other applications to this urls.py file. So right now you can see here we have an admin path, and if you're curious what paths do, I can go ahead and explain it for you. So I can say, let's just say that our website is example.com. all right, so if we're using this as a URL path, that URL path is going to look like example.com/admin. okay, so this is what this URL path essentially is affecting, if that makes sense. Okay, so what we're going to do here is inside of the project's urls.py, essentially what you do is you connect your apps to this file, and then you use the urls.py file inside of your individual applications. In this project, we only have one application, and it's called main. So in order to link these together, I'm going to say path, and then I'm going to have 2 single quotes and leave them empty, and then I'm going to say include, and then inside of parentheses I'm going to say main.urls. okay, and then I'm gonna go ahead and put a comma there. So this is going to look inside of our main, our application called main, and then it's going to look for the URLs file. Right now we don't have a URLs file, so we'll actually fix that in a second, but let's finish the rest of our paths here in the URL path. So if you remember, we did have tinymce, and we also do have Django all auth. Well, we do need to actually include paths for those as well. So I'm going to say path, and then I'm going to say tinymce, and then I'm going to say include, and then I'm going to say tinymce.urls, okay? And then I'm going to put a comma, and it's basically the same thing for Django all auth, except this one is accounts, and then it's include, and I think it's all auth.urls, and then that's going to be in single quotes as well. And then you're going to always make sure you have a comma after your last entry, otherwise your application will break. Okay, all right, so this should work for what we need in the urls.py for the project, but like I said, we need a urls.py for the main application now. So let's go to the main application right here, which we named main. I'm going to right click it, I'm going to say new file, I'm going to say urls.py and just smash my enter. Nice. All right, so now you can see now it says we have a urls.py for my project and then a urls.py for main. I'm going to copy this stuff. That way I don't have to like rewrite a whole bunch of code. I'm going to delete admin because ultimately it's going to be the same formatting, but we're going to put a little bit different things in here. Okay, so let's think about what are the URL pages that we'd like for our website, which is ultimately going to be a blogging website. Probably want a home page, an about page, maybe a page to show all of our posts, a page to show individual posts, and then a profile page potentially, because we do have the functionality of account management through Django All-Auth. So let's create a home page first. So first thing we're going to put is a URL path here. So in this case, what is the home path of any like website you go to? So if you're looking at example.com, there is no home path, right? So there's a slash, and then after that, there's nothing, right? So if you put single quotes here, right, there's essentially nothing in here, right? So this is just saying, hey, when you're at like the base of the domain, then you're at the home page, essentially, right? So that's what that's saying. So the next thing we're going to put here is we're going to put views.home, and one thing I need to add here is I need to make sure to say from.import views. Okay, so I'm going to say views.home. Essentially what this is saying here is it's going to look at our views.py file, which is right here, and it's going to look for a method or function called home. And then it's going to look in that method and see what it is that needs to be ran. It's going to run it, and then hopefully, you know, your web page gets displayed. The thing after that, we're going to give it a name, and I'm just going to name this home. Okay, so you're kind of seeing like a naming convention here. So typically speaking, I'll name the view name and the actual name here the same name, and unless you're talking about the home page, typically for the path right here, I'm going to give it the same name as well. So if we want an about page, I'll just write this one out really quick for us so you can understand what I'm talking about. I'll say like it's about, that way it's going to look like this. About, that would be the URL for it, right? I'm going to say views.about, and then name is equal to about. So you're kind of getting it now. We've got about, okay? So let's go over to our views, and I'll kind of show you what these are supposed to look like. Let's start importing some things. So I'm gonna import redirect here because we'll most likely need it later on. I'll say from Django.http, we can import HTTP response. Then I'm going to say from our models, we want to import everything. And then I'm going to say from Django contrib.auth decorators, we want to import login required. All right, sweet. So now we have all these imports. Not too many to start because I don't want to overwhelm you guys or gals. But here's where we're going to get in with the methods, right? So I'm going to say define home. So we're making a home function, and we're passing in the request. And then I'm just going to return something simple like an HTTP response. And then I'm just going to say home, okay? And let's do the same thing for about. So I'll say from about right here. We're going to pass through the request again. And then I'm going to say return HTTP response, and then I'm just going to say about me, okay? So you can kind of see it's going to go to the views.home for the home page, and it's going to look at this, and it's just going to return right now a blank page that just says home on it. Now if you go to the about URL, it's going to look at the about view, which is right here, and then it's going to view a blank HTML page that just says about me, okay? So let's go ahead and finish these URL paths here. I'm just going to end up copying these and just pasting them because it's just code duplication at this point. But I say we need probably a posts page. So I'm going to change this to posts. I'm going to change that to posts. Probably want a singular post page. So for this one's going to be kind of unique, and I'll get into why it's like this potentially in the next video. But we are going to need what we're calling a slug here, and I will be explaining this actually in the end of this video, but I won't be getting into the view architecture of it yet. And let's see, lastly we'll probably need a profile page, right? So hopefully you're understanding kind of the naming convention that's going on here. You can see posts, 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 profile, 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 post, 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 okay? Now, because we are getting technically like an argument here with this slug, we will have to actually pass something else through in the view for that. And I'll get into that actually right now, but it's not going to be complicated. The complicated part's going to come later. So we already had the about page. We already have the home page. Let's go ahead and get the posts page. So again, I'm going to pass through requests, and I'm just going to return HTTP response, and in here I'm just going to say posts. Okay, then I'm going to say this one's for the post, so we're going to pass through the request, but we're also going to pass through a slug because that's what we're looking for right in here. Okay, so we're going to pass through the slug too. I'm going to return HTTP response, and I'm just going to put post here, nothing really special for now. And then the last one is profile. Again, we're going to pass through the request, and I'm going to return the HTTP response, and this one, you've guessed it, I'm just going to say profile. So now we have all of our URL paths, we have all of our views, everything should be working right now, but before I test that, I do want to go through our models and explain kind of what we should be looking at for our models. Okay, so our models, kind of to explain, these are actually Python models, and essentially what they are is they store data for a Python object, and then when you migrate your database, or when you migrate the database, it pushes these model objects to your database, so your database can essentially make the tables for these objects and format correctly for these objects. Then once you actually get your website up and running, these models, let's say, like, because we're going to make a post, like a blog post model, once you create a post, it's actually going to be storing that post in your MySQL database underneath this model, essentially, in the model format. So let's push some imports in here. So I'm going to say from Django c.urls import reverse. All right, I'm going to say from auto slug, I want to import auto slug field. I want to say from tinymce because we want to use tinymce. Import models as tinymce models, and then from Django contrib auth models import user. All right, hopefully I didn't. Oh, there's a spelling mistake. Now Django should tell you these spelling mistakes if you try and run or migrate your database. It should tell you if you made any mistakes, but just double check your spelling. I'm obviously trying my best to double check mine. Anyways, we have all of our initial imports finished. So now what we need to do is we need to actually create our models, and I'm going to be walking you through this creation. So the first thing I actually want to do is I want to give our user, our administrator, the choice of either making a blog post published or a draft. So kind of like giving it a status, if you will. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I'm going to make a group called choices. So it's going to say group choices is equal to, and essentially we want two states for this, right? We want a published state. Let's put a comma after that. And then we also want a draft state, right? So we have these two different states now for our choices that we're able to choose, okay? And you can make different choices. You can add more than two. You can have a different name. You can have different names for them. This is just what I'm choosing for now, okay? Now that's not a model, but that's just something that will help us create choices within our model, okay? This is going to be the model. So I'm going to say class post, and then it's going to say models.model. And like I said, this is a Python object. So what are some important fields to have here within our post or blog post model? Probably want a title, right? So in here, let's use a char field. All right. Now a char field is just going to hold different characters, so it stands for character field. So essentially, your title is just going to be a string of a bunch of different characters. So this is perfect for that, right? What's the first argument I'm going to use here? Well, the first argument I'm going to use is just going to be the name of the field I'm using, so that's going to be title. If I named this something else, if maybe I wanted to name it title post, I could just name this if I wanted to title post, or you could just leave this as title. This is up to you, okay? I'm just trying to keep things the same across the board, so we're just going to keep it the same as title. Let's establish a max length of 200, and then I'll just say that this can be null and it can be blank, all right? And I'll kind of be using these very repetitively throughout the different fields. What's something else that we want? We'll probably want a description. And description is going to be maybe like a small description, a short description that maybe you're going to show on your home page or your posts page to kind of give the user a little bit of insight on what the post is about without having to read, 3,000 different lines, okay? So for the description, we're going to be using TinyMCE. So I'll say TinyMCE models.html field, and then I'll be using as parameters these two. Bam. All right. So if you're curious what TinyMCE does, I'll show you. I think it'll probably be in the next video, but essentially it's a rich text editor, and it allows you to format your text in many different ways. You can create lists, you can create unordered lists, ordered lists, you can, style the text, you can color it, you can change the font, you can change the size. There's a whole bunch of different things that TinyMCE will allow you to do that Django by default will not. So it's definitely something that I think is critical for a blog object. The next thing we're going to want here is the body of the post. So I'm just going to copy the TinyMCE HTML field into the body, because we're going to need that for the body as well. Probably would like a status, and the status is going to leverage these choices. However, I'm going to use a char field for this as well. I'm going to call this one status, okay? And I would like to essentially give this one a very short max length because these are predefined lengths. And the next thing I need to do is I need to clarify what choices I would like to use. Well, I would like to use the group choices, right? Well, if I'm using choices, I also need to clarify which choice by default should it be. Well, I think it's most intuitive to make it a draft by default. If I'm creating a new blog post and I save it, I would prefer it not to be saved as published by default. I would prefer to look over it one more time and then manually change it to published by default. But if you'd like it the other way, you're more than welcome to change draft to publish, and it'll automatically publish. It'll automatically publish once you click save. And when I say automatically, I'm going to, input that logic eventually. But right now, it currently will not automatically do that. But we will be checking the status of the blog posts before making them viewable, essentially, okay? Now I'm going to be adding the null and the blank at the end of this, right there. All right, what's the next thing we need? Well, we might want a photo, right? So I'm going to use what is called an image field, okay? And I'm going to call this the post image, sweet. And we're going to give this a max length of, let's just give it a 200, that way it's not short in any way. And then I'm just going to say null and blank are equal to true, all right? Now, one of the last fields, we have two more fields. One of the last ones here is going to be what we call a slug. Now, I kind of touched on a slug earlier. So essentially what a slug is going to do, and I'll kind of give you an example right here. Let's say you have, your website that I've been talking about, example.com, right? Well, what if you're populating your URLs off the title of your blog post? So let's say the blog post is, "This is awesome," right? That's the title of your blog post. You can see here there's spaces, right here and right here. So that's not really the best way to format your URLs. What you should do is you should slugify your URLs, and what that will do is it will remove these spaces and input hyphens. So now it's actually a workable URL. So that's essentially why we're using the slug field, so we can create a slug automatically. That's not something I want to manually do all the time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this a name. Oh, whoops, I'm not ready yet. I need to give it the field first, so we're going to say auto slug field. Then I'm going to give it the name of slug. That way we know what it is. and I'm going to give it a max length, let's say, of 50. I can't imagine we're going to have more than 50 characters in a title. Now we do want it to be unique, otherwise we'd have the same URLs, right? Now we need to make sure it's populating from something. So what makes most sense to populate it from? I would say the title. So it's going to be populating from this title. You can see title. And then again, I'll say for this one, blank equals true, and then I'll say editable is equal to true. That way, if we have any problems with how it's generating the slugs, or we just want to make a special slug for this particular post, we can just go ahead and do that. All right. Now, the last field that we're going to be throwing in here is called date, and we're going to be using the date time field for this one, and I'm just going to give it the name of date created, and we can say auto add auto now. It's not. All right, we can say auto now add is equal to true, and then I'll say null is equal to true. Okay, so what auto now add does is once you create this post initially, it's going to automatically grab the date and time and just throw it in here automatically for you. So again, an automated process. This is a really great field to have, and it's a field that I really feel like you should have for any of your models. So we're done with the fields, but now we need to create two functions inside of here. So the first one we need is we should try and get the absolute URL of this particular object. So self is referring to this post object, okay? So what are we trying to do? Well, we're returning the reverse of, we want to return the reverse of post, and then we want some keyword arguments in here. And we want to make sure we're getting the slug, right? And we want to get the slug from itself. So what we're doing is we're essentially passing into post this post right here, which is inside of views, post. We're essentially giving it the access to slug, if that makes sense, okay? The last thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to define a way for this to name itself, okay? So I'm just going to return self.title. So when I'm looking at this in like an admin page, it's going to just return the name of the title of the blog post in order for me to identify which post I'm looking at, okay? So that is going to be the model structure for our blog post. Now let's create one for comment, okay? So I'm going to say class comment. I'm going to say models.model. And this one's actually going to be a bit more advanced, so I'm going to have to talk a little bit more about it. Let's create a field called commenter. And we're going to create a foreign key here, okay? If you're not familiar with what a foreign key is, essentially it gives this model access to another model. It like attaches them, essentially, if that makes sense. So, and I'll explain what this means when I finish typing this specific one out. Set null is equal to true. All right, so let me explain this particular one. All right, so we have a field here called commenter. So what I'm anticipating trying to hold in this particular field is I'd like to keep track of what user made this comment, if that makes sense. So if I'm commenting on a specific blog post, I would like to know what user that is. That way I can always display their username attached to the comment, if that makes sense, okay? In order to do that, we need to use a foreign key so we can grab that user data and store it with the comment, okay? What else do we need? Well, if we're trying to attach this comment to a user and a post, we also need to use a foreign key for the blog post. So I'm going to say post, and we're going to say models.foreign key, and then in here I'm going to say post because that's the name of the model, and then I'm going to say null is equal to true. And I'm going to say on delete, basically the same thing up here. Bam, we got on delete set null. And then I'm going to give this one a related name is equal to comments. Now, I'm not going to explain this one right now. I'll come back and explain it when I get to the point. It'll be in the next video. But this is important that you have that in there, so just type it out for now. I'll explain it when we get to that point in time. Now, what we need to do is we need to create a new field called comment. And this is going to be a new field called text field that I haven't talked about yet. And this is going to propagate a field in which a user on your website can type in, okay? So we need to give this a default, and you can just say your comment here, okay? Now we can give this a max length, let's just say 255, and then I'll say null is equal to false for this one, because if you're entering a user comment, you know, you don't want it to be empty. You want it to have something, right? So we don't want it to be empty in this case. What this default essentially does is in the text box that populates on your website, it'll automatically have these words in it. So your user can look at the text box and say, your comment here, oh, okay, I'm supposed to type in here, okay? All right, so the last field is actually just going to be date. I'll just copy the one from up here again. Bam, right there. And then I'm going to do something interesting with this one, and I'm going to say class meta. All right, and I'm going to change the ordering of these. And the reason why I'm going to change the ordering of these is because by default in Django, it'll show the oldest on top, if that makes sense. And what we want is we want the newest on top, not the oldest. So I'm going to change the order of these by the date, okay? Right here, the date. And so that the hyphen or the minus in front of the date means that I want the opposite of what the date is, if that makes sense. And I'm going to need to make sure that I have this in single quotes, okay? Awesome. So what we can do now is I can actually make migrations. So I'm going to say Python manage.py make migrations. You can see here that we've got our post, we've got our comment, and I can say Python manage.py migrate. And now you're going to see that our migration was okay. Now let's go ahead and run the server. So I'm going to say Python manage.py run server. Let's open this up. And now you can see if I can kind of show you here. So we've got our home right here. And let me go to the URL so we can see all the different URLs that we have. We've got the home. We've got posts. You can see here, change the name posts. We've got, if it lets me click this, we've got the about, bam, about me. And we should have profile, okay? All right, well, I really appreciate everyone's time with me in this particular video. And I really look forward to the next video where we'll be going over how to create more elaborate views. We'll be going over how to create our HTML templates in the hierarchy, and then I'll also be going through how to start our admin panel and get our admin panel going. Anyways, thank you for following me, and I hope to see you in the next video. Later.